Our gospel reading is from Mark 9, verses 2 through 9. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up a high mountain, where they were all alone. There he was transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And there appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say. They were so frightened. Then a cloud appeared and covered them, and a voice came from the cloud. "This is my Son, whom I love. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead.
Who watched the Super Bowl last week? Okay, most people did. One of my favorite commercials from the Super Bowl last week was the Tide commercials. All of the different ones. Those were pretty good. And they made the claim that every other commercial was actually what? A Tide ad, right? So this is what we read in Mark chapter 9, verses 2 and 3. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up a high mountain, where they were all alone. There he was transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. It's low-hanging fruit, right? The Transfiguration, though, is not a Tide ad, all right? It says me and every other lectionary preacher this morning. It's something supernatural. And what's more, the Transfiguration is actually beyond our understanding. Here is Jesus before 3 of his disciples. Some would call them his inner circle. And he suddenly becomes dazzling white. I would imagine that it was the same kind of effect that Moses saw and received when he was exposed up on Mount Sinai getting the 10 Commandments to God's presence. Where afterwards his face glowed when he came down the mountain. And the effect is the same on other people, because just as the people of Israel were terrified of God's presence in Exodus, so too were the people, the disciples that were with Jesus, terrified about what they saw happening to Jesus. This is what the verses 5 and 6 say. Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it's good for us to be here. Let's put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say. He was so frightened, so he just said, "Whatever." He's frightened, so just say whatever. That's not like a Tide ad at all, isn't it? Is it? What I'm trying to say is when we truly encounter the divine, it's like nothing that we've ever experienced. And as I've been saying about God's holiness in recent weeks, it's an experience of utter otherness. God is not like anything in creation because God is not a part of creation. So when Jesus reveals his true divine identity to the disciples on that mountain, it scares them. Well, I think there's at least a few things that we can get this morning from looking at the Transfiguration. And our lectionary gives us some help by pairing Jesus' story of the Transfiguration with this passage from 2 Kings chapter 2. Now this passage concerns the succession of Elijah, the great prophet of the northern kingdom of Israel. If you want to read about him, you should read 1 Kings. But Elijah comes after the ancient kingdom of Israel splits in two, between the northern kingdom of Israel with its capital of Samaria and the southern kingdom of Judah with its capital in Jerusalem. Now we often think about Judah as being the more faithful kingdom, right? Judah had the temple. It also had David's family as their line of kings. And we get a lot of prophetic writings out of the southern kingdom. But the truth is that Israel's second greatest prophet, the second greatest prophet in the Old Testament, other than Moses, is Elijah. And Elijah comes out of the northern kingdom. He's part of the northern story. It's a reminder that God didn't forget the northern kingdom, that God was still concerned for reaching the northern kingdom, even after they separated themselves from Jerusalem and the temple. What happened was the northern kingdom, in order to keep people from going to Jerusalem to worship, built their own temple. They built it at the site of where the tabernacle once sat, at Bethel. And they had their own prophetic and priestly traditions in the northern kingdom. Now, the southern kingdom would have considered these things a counterfeit of the real thing. But it seems in these stories of Elijah and Elisha that as much as they could be faithful and tried to be faithful in the north, that God honored that. It's the spirit of Elijah. It doesn't come from the southern kingdom. It doesn't come from Jerusalem. It comes from somewhere else. It's that same spirit that is said to have rested on John the Baptist. He was like Elijah reborn. But who is it, again, that appears with Jesus on the mountain? It's Moses and Elijah. And neither one of them set foot in Jerusalem. Elijah was mostly a solitary man. But toward the end of his ministry, he picked up a disciple with a similar name, Elisha. And in this final account of Elijah's life, they're about to have an experience that's really beyond description. They make a journey from the capital, Samaria, on to Gilgal, where Elijah asks Elisha to stay behind. And Elisha says this, "As surely as the Lord lives, and as you live, I will not leave you." That's a pretty, I would say, emphatic reply, right? And so they go on to Bethel, where the temple of the northern kingdom was. And a company of prophets comes out to meet them. And they speak only to Elisha. And they say this, "Do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" It's a nice message, right? And his reply is, "Yes, I know. Be quiet." The truth is that Elisha doesn't know, but he's on pins and needles here. It's like when you're about to do something that's kind of scary for the first time, and people come around you and they try to comfort you, or they try to tell you what it's going to be like and that you'll be fine. And you just say, "Yep, I know," but you'd rather not think about it. That's what's going on with Elisha. These prophets mean no harm, but they're not exactly helpful either. That will preach, won't it? Sometimes the best thing we can do in the church is what? Not to give free advice, but just to listen. Anyway, the passage, in our passage, as it moves on, the same thing happens in Jericho. Elijah urges him to stay behind, and he says no, and he tells a group of prophets to be quiet, and he knows what's going to happen. And then things take a turn in the story. They pass by Jericho, they cross over the Jordan River by parting the river in two, and when they get to the other side, it's as if Elisha has passed some kind of test. Now, do you notice the route that they go? It's the same route that the Israelites came in, right? To the Holy Land, the Promised Land. They go out that way. But Elijah says to Elisha, "What can I do for you before I go?" And Elisha asks for a double portion of his master's spirit. Now, what's the significance of a double portion? Well, a double portion is the inheritance of a firstborn son in that tradition. And Elisha wants to succeed his master Elijah not as another prophet. He wants to succeed him as his son. And it's actually a very moving request when we understand what's going on. And this is what Elijah says in verse 10. He says, "You have asked a difficult thing. Yet if you see me when I am taken from you, it will be yours. Otherwise, it will not be." So in other words, I have no idea if I can do that for you. But we'll see what God does with that request. Fair enough. But after that, it's when this thing happens. A chariot of fire led by a team of fiery horses, not quite chariots of fire, comes and he carries Elijah off into heaven. And it's so intense that it leaves Elisha just kind of babbling this description of the scene. You know, he's overwhelmed. It's kind of like what Peter says, isn't it? And when it's all over and he recovers himself, he tears his clothes. It's a sign of mourning in the Old Testament. He's alone. He's alone just like his master Elijah was for most of his ministry. In this scene of transition, it's almost like a scene from Star Wars, right? Between the Jedi Master and the Jedi disciple. Kind of reminds me of that a little bit. Very mysterious. He doesn't truly die, does he? Elijah. He's carried up into heaven. But after this is all over and you read on, if you keep reading in this passage, you see that Elisha actually does inherit Elijah's spirit. He's been transfigured into Elijah. Or at least he carries the mantle of his master. He parts the river Jordan with Elijah's cloak. He retraces his steps, one step at a time, all the way back to Samaria. And it's there that he carries out his own prophetic ministry. He leaves Israel an apprentice, and he enters Israel a full-fledged prophet. And I kind of like that idea, to make a journey for ordination. It's kind of a neat thing. When we pair this passage with our New Testament passage, what do we get? What's the message for us in the Transfiguration? Well, it's all about encountering the mystery of God. And I want to stress that point because so often we put God in a nice little box and we expect God to stay there and play by our rules. But God doesn't do that. And we need to be open to surprises from God. God is mysterious. The revelation of God in the Bible is only a piece. It's enough for us to believe, but it's only a tiny piece. How do you fully describe an infinite God? It's impossible. Even John admits toward the end of his gospel that he's only written down enough of Jesus' life so that we could believe. He says if he wrote everything down, it would fill all the volumes in the world. So we need to be prepared for God to show up even when we least expect it. God bursts out of our boxes that we put God in. Last week I had a funny moment during the children's story at Hope. And all of a sudden I was in very deep water with them, teaching them something that I did not expect. But they had a question. And it was a really, really cool conversation. And that's how it is. That's how God shows up. Sometimes you just really don't expect it in places. Here's something else about encountering the mystery of God that we need to understand. I think it's very important that everyone encounters that mystery differently. Everyone encounters the mystery of God differently. And I think that's the second thing we need to get from the Transfiguration today. In the Transfiguration, we learn how to respect the experience of other Christians. Now, how's that? Well, I'm glad you asked. So often, nobody asked, but I'm pretending that you did. So often we impose our own expectations, our own experience on others. And this is especially true of conversion stories, isn't it? We have a nice little checkbox in our minds so that we can really see if someone is authentically a believer or not. You know, they have to say the right things, you know. But how many disciples did Jesus have?
12.
He had 12, right? How many did he bring with him up onto the mountain?
2.
He brought 3. Only 3 of his 12 disciples experienced this moment. How about the number of prophets that Elijah and Elisha encountered in 2 Kings chapter 2? 100, right? 50 in Bethel, 50 in Jericho. How many were with Elijah and Elisha in their moment together? None. Was their faith not as great? Were some better than others? Were the ones that were left behind less faithful? Well, it's interesting here. What does Jesus tell the three when they come back down on the mountain, off the mountain?
Don't tell nobody.
Yeah, he says in verse 9, as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. Don't tell anyone. This is between us. Why? Why would Jesus say that? Well, I think maybe in part his disciples were prone to error, as we all are. And I'm sure that Jesus was concerned that they might have held this over each other. I mean, at various points they asked for privileged positions over and against each other. Maybe the three would have been tempted to look down on the 9. And the other 9 would have maybe had a little contempt for these 3. That mountaintop experience could have become divisive when God meant it for good. And unfortunately, that's all too true in the church, isn't it? Those who feel like they've been to the mountain, sometimes they look down on those who haven't. But we're confusing call with authentic faith. And everyone has a place at the table. All the disciples, except Judas, and that was by his own choice, end up in the same place at Pentecost, don't they? They all end up in the upper room, and they all receive the Holy Spirit. But all are called uniquely. So let's make sure that when we think about our own experiences of God, that we use those things for good. The good that God intends, and not for division. Because if we pull all of our experiences together, guess what happens? The church gets lifted up. The gospel gets lifted up instead of being torn down. I think Paul mentions that in his letters on occasion, doesn't he? He says, there are many gifts, but one Spirit. There are many parts, but one body of Christ. So be the best part you can be, however your experience is, however you've been called. Remember, every person, that you're not the whole thing. Thirdly, the Transfiguration is a taste of the future. Generally, it's a display of Jesus' future glory and also Jesus' past glory, right? But it's also about succession, just as it was for Elijah and Elisha. When Jesus comes off the mountain, he goes down to Jerusalem, where he's arrested and tried and executed. And eventually he rises from the dead. And when he does, he tells his disciples to wait there in the city. And what happens? Well, the Holy Spirit comes at Pentecost and rests on them and in them. And they're, what? They're transfigured too, aren't they? They receive the same Spirit. They take up the mantle of Jesus' ministry, and the church is born. Now, how do we hand things off successfully? We're not good at that, are we? Even within the Methodist appointment system, where we should be pros at this, right? Because we hand things off. We're not good at handing things from one pastor to another, as you may have experienced in the past. But what about ministry in the local church? What about ministry in the local church? How do we successfully hand things off to the next generation? Well, it begs the question, right? Is there a next generation to hand things off to? Have we reached out to disciple the next generation? Have we invited them along in the journey? I'm here in ministry because so many people invited me along on their own discipleship journeys. And they brought me along, and as they brought me along, they also brought me up. What are we doing to develop the next generation of leaders for our church and for the greater church? When I was growing up here, I was fortunate to be a part of things where there are still 3 of us in ministry within the United Methodist Church, and there are others who are still very much a dynamic part of their churches. The Transfiguration calls us on a church to think about leadership development and to do something about it. And lastly, because of where this event falls, what's happening on Wednesday? Ash Wednesday, thank you. And what happens on Ash Wednesday? It's the beginning of Lent. Okay. Because of where this event falls, where we celebrate it, the Transfiguration can be about being invited into solitude before the season of Lent. And when it was all over, Jesus was alone with his disciples. The people who could really understand his experience, Moses and Elijah, they had come and gone in just a few minutes. His disciples wouldn't really understand their master until after he left them. He was, in his position, essentially alone. And Elisha, after his master is taken up to heaven, is profoundly alone, isn't he? We kind of get that sense as he tears his clothes in anguish. But it's important to learn to be alone with God. Even if we already live alone, or we spend large portions of our day on our own. For most people, what's the experience of being alone? It's lonely, right? Being alone is lonely. And I think as a church, we have to help people understand and learn to be sustained by God's Spirit when the company of others isn't enough, or when people aren't there for us. So that even when the church falls down in care, people understand that they're not alone in life's storms. God is with them. And during Lent, we're asked to take a deeper turn toward God. And a very powerful way to do that is to have time alone, on purpose, in silence. In our passages today, the prophets speak, and what does Elisha say? Be quiet. Peter speaks, and a voice from heaven says, listen. Do you get the idea? Sometimes we're busy speaking, and so we miss the message. We need to quiet our voices. We need to learn how to quiet our minds so that we can hear, so that we can experience, so we have a chance to be surprised by God's presence. And so that's a taste of what the Transfiguration is all about and what it's for us this morning.